What if the village bully tormented the wrong girl, one bound by blood oath to creatures so powerful they could tear apart kingdoms? This tale of ancient justice follows Aeliana Blackthorn, a quiet outsider who arrived in the medieval village of Thornmere 3 moons ago. She keeps to herself, works in the shadows, and watches the forest edge every night as if waiting for something or someone. Garrick Ironhand, the blacksmith's brutal son, rules Thornmere through fear and violence. He's never met anyone who didn't cower before him. So when he sees Aeliana, alone, different, vulnerable, he thinks he's found his easiest victim yet. But Garrick doesn't know that Aeliana carries a silver pendant marked with ancient symbols. He doesn't know about the treaty his grandfather swore 70 years ago, and he certainly doesn't know that the howls echoing from the forest each night aren't just wolves, they're her family. The blood moon rises in 3 days, and when it does, Garrick Ironhand will learn that some mistakes can't be undone, some girls shouldn't be touched, and some fathers are werewolves. Stay until the moon turns red, because what begins with a bully's cruelty will end with ancient reckoning. Aeliana Blackthorn pressed her palms against the cold glass of her window, watching the tree line as the first gray light of dawn crept across the horizon. There, between the ancient oaks at the forest edge, 3 massive shapes moved through the mist. Wolves. But not just any wolves. Her breath fogged the glass as she traced their path with her eyes, and for a moment the largest one stopped and turned its silver gaze directly toward her window. She placed her hand over the pendant beneath her rough linen shift, feeling its familiar weight against her chest. 3 moons since she'd arrived in Thornmere. 3 moons of waiting. The village sprawled below her like something from an old tapestry, timber-framed houses with thatched roofs, narrow cobblestone streets still slick with morning dew, and the blacksmith's forge already beginning to glow at the village center. Smoke curled from chimneys as the settlement stirred to life. Thornmere was ancient, settled centuries ago in the shadow of the great forest, and like all old places, it had long memories and deep suspicions. Strangers weren't welcome here. Outsiders were watched, questioned, kept at arm's length until they proved themselves worthy of trust or left on their own. Aeliana had learned quickly to make herself invisible. She rented the cramped room above Master Wyndham's chandlery shop, paying her modest rent by running errands and doing work no one else wanted. She hauled water from the well before dawn, gathered firewood from the forest edge, never venturing too deep, and helped the weaver's widow card wool until her fingers cramped. The villagers tolerated her presence because she was useful and quiet. They didn't ask questions she couldn't answer, and she didn't give them reasons to wonder about the girl who watched the forest like she was waiting for something to emerge from its depths. Her routine was careful, calculated. She kept her head down in the market square, spoke only when spoken to, and made sure she was back in her room before the sun set and the howling began. Every night she would sit at her window and listen to the wolves singing to the moon, and every night she would whisper back words in the old tongue that Fenrir had taught her. I am still here. I am still waiting. It was during her 2nd week in Thornmere that she first heard about Garrick Ironhand. She'd been buying bread from the baker when 2 women entered, speaking in hushed, frightened tones. He broke young Thomas's arm yesterday for looking at him wrong, one whispered. His own father won't even check him anymore. The boy's a demon in human skin. The other woman crossed herself. God help anyone who crosses that one. Aeliana had taken her bread and left quietly, but she'd filed the name away. Garrick Ironhand.
the blacksmith's son, the village monster. She saw him for the first time 3 days later and understood immediately why people lowered their eyes when he passed. He was broad-shouldered and tall, with the kind of casual cruelty in his expression that came from years of unchecked power. He walked through the market square like he owned it, flanked by 2 other young men who laughed too loudly at everything he said. When a young boy accidentally bumped into him, Garrick shoved the child into the mud without breaking stride. No one said a word. No one dared. Aeliana had looked away, but not before Garrick's eyes had flickered toward her, curious, assessing. She'd felt the weight of his attention like a cold hand on her neck. That evening, when she bought candles from Master Wyndham, the village elder, Aldrich Greystone, had been in the shop. He was ancient, bent with age, but his eyes were still sharp. He'd watched her count out her coins, and then his gaze had dropped to her neckline, where the silver pendant had slipped free from her dress. For a long moment, he'd stared at the intricate wolf's head etched into the metal, at the symbols carved along its edge. Then he looked up at her face, and something like recognition, or perhaps fear, had flickered in his expression. "Where did you get that?" he'd asked quietly. "It was a gift," Aeliana had replied, tucking it back beneath her dress. "From my father." The elder had studied her for another moment, then nodded slowly. "Best keep it hidden, girl. Some symbols carry weight in these parts." She'd left the chandlery with her candles and the uncomfortable feeling that Aldrich Greystone knew far more than he was saying. And that night, when the wolves howled, she'd gripped her pendant and whispered into the darkness, "Soon, father. It has to be soon."
Market day in Thornmere was a riot of color and noise that transformed the usually somber village square. Merchants spread their wares across wooden stalls, bundles of dried lavender and sage, wheels of cheese wrapped in cloth, iron tools still warm from the forge. The air smelled of fresh bread, roasting meat, and the earthy scent of vegetables pulled from the ground that morning. Children darted between adults' legs, while chickens pecked at scattered grain on the cobblestones. Women in wool dresses haggled over prices, their voices rising and falling like music, while men gathered near the ale cellar to exchange news and gossip. Aeliana moved through the crowd like a shadow, her woven basket tucked against her hip. She'd spent the early morning gathering wild herbs from the forest edge, yarrow for fever, St. John's wort for wounds, dried mushrooms the healer had requested. It was dangerous work, venturing so close to the tree line, but it paid better than most tasks available to her. She'd learned which plants grew in the liminal spaces between village and wilderness, and the healer paid fair coin for what the forest offered. She was examining a merchant's dried fish when she felt the shift in the crowd's energy. Conversations didn't stop exactly, but they quieted, became more careful. People's shoulders tensed. A mother pulled her child closer. Aeliana didn't need to turn around to know that Garrick Ironhand had entered the square. He moved through the market with his usual entourage, 2 thick-necked boys who served as his shadows, laughing at his jokes and glaring at anyone who didn't move out of their way fast enough. Garrick himself was dressed better than most, his leather vest well oiled and his boots barely scuffed. The blacksmith's trade brought good money, and Garrick wore his father's wealth like armor. Aeliana kept her head down and tried to slip toward the chandlery, but Garrick's voice cut through the market noise like a blade. "Well, well, the forest girl." She stopped. Every instinct Fenrir had taught her screamed to assess the threat, identify exits, prepare for confrontation. But she was supposed to be just another village girl, scared and powerless. So she turned slowly, keeping her expression neutral. Garrick stood 3 paces away, arms crossed, that familiar cruel smirk playing at his lips. His friends flanked him, already grinning in anticipation of entertainment.
A circle of space had opened around them as merchants and villagers suddenly found reasons to examine their wares more closely. "Didn't your mother teach you to greet your betters?" Garrick said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "I have no mother," Aeliana replied quietly. "That explains the smell." His friends laughed on cue. "What's in the basket? Weeds and mushrooms? Is that what passes for trade goods where you're from?" Aeliana said nothing. She could feel the crowd watching, some with pity, others with the guilty fascination people always had for cruelty when it was directed at someone else. Garrick took a step closer, and Aeliana's grip tightened on her basket. She could smell the ale on his breath, see the boredom in his eyes that came from someone who'd never faced real consequences. He was looking for entertainment, for someone to humiliate, to remind the village who held power here. "I asked you a question, girl." Before she could respond, Garrick reached out and knocked the basket from her hands. It tumbled through the air, and herbs scattered across the muddy cobblestones, weeks of careful gathering destroyed in an instant. The dried St. John's wort crushed under his boot as he deliberately stepped forward, then again and again, grinding the precious herbs into the filth while maintaining eye contact with her. Some people in the crowd laughed nervously. Others looked away, shame coloring their faces, but not enough to make them intervene. A merchant 2 stalls down suddenly became very interested in counting his coins. Aeliana stared at the ruined herbs, at the mud seeping through the woven basket her landlady had lent her. She felt the familiar heat rising in her chest, not anger exactly, but something older and more primal, the wolf song that Fenrir had taught her to control. She breathed slowly, counted to 5, and pushed it down.
When she looked up, Garrick was grinning wider, waiting for tears or pleading or rage, any reaction he could mock. Instead, Aeliana bent down and began gathering what could be salvaged, placing each crushed stem carefully back into her basket. Her movements were deliberate, unhurried. When she straightened, she met his eyes and spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. But in the sudden silence of the market square, everyone heard. "The moon sees all, Garrick Ironhand." His grin faltered. "What did you say?" Aeliana tilted her head slightly, and for just a moment her eyes caught the light in a way that made them seem almost reflective, almost golden. "I said, the moon sees all, and she remembers." Garrick's confusion was obvious. His friends shifted uncomfortably, unsure if this was still funny. The crowd had gone completely quiet now, and in that silence, from somewhere in the distant forest, came the long, low howl of a wolf. Several villagers made signs against evil. Garrick's face flushed red, his jaw clenching. "You threatening me, witch?" Before Aeliana could respond, a gnarled hand appeared at her elbow. Aldrich Greystone, the village elder, had emerged from the crowd. His weathered face was unreadable as he bent down to help gather the scattered herbs. "Enough, boy," he said quietly, not looking at Garrick. "You've had your fun." Garrick looked like he wanted to argue, but something about the elder's tone, or perhaps the way other villagers were beginning to murmur, made him reconsider. He spat into the mud near Aeliana's feet and turned away, his friends trailing behind him like loyal hounds. As the crowd slowly returned to its business, Aldrich worked beside Aeliana in silence. When most of the herbs were gathered, he spoke without looking at her, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "Your father. When does he return?" Aeliana's hands stilled. "How did you—" "The pendant isn't the only thing I recognize, child." His old eyes finally met hers. "I was there when the treaty was made. I remember the Alpha's face." He pressed a crushed sprig of yarrow into her basket. "So I ask again, when does he return?" Aeliana glanced toward the forest, where the wolves had been that morning. 3 nights, when the blood moon rises." Aldrich nodded slowly, something like resignation crossing his features. "Then pray the Ironhand boy learns wisdom quickly." He stood with difficulty, his joints cracking. because some mistakes cannot be forgiven, even by old treaties. He shuffled away, leaving Aeliana alone in the market square, clutching her ruined basket and watching Garrick's broad shoulders disappear into the crowd. The moon sees all, she thought again, and in 3 nights, so would everyone else.
The chapel of Thornmere was older than anyone could remember, its stone walls thick with centuries of prayers and secrets. Narrow windows of colored glass cast fractured light across worn wooden pews, and the air hung heavy with frankincense and beeswax. As evening descended and shadows gathered in the corners, the villagers filed in for vespers, as they had every night for generations, seeking comfort and ritual and the illusion of safety that sacred ground provided. Aeliana sat near the back, pressed against the cold stone wall where she could watch both the door and the congregation. The chapel was nearly full tonight. Market day always brought people together, and after the incident in the square, she'd felt the weight of curious glances following her through the village. Better to attend prayers than give them more reason to whisper about the strange outsider girl. Father Benedict stood at the simple altar, his weathered hands raising the cross as he began the evening devotions. His voice echoed off stone, familiar Latin phrases that most villagers didn't understand but found soothing nonetheless. Women clutched prayer beads, men bowed their heads, children fidgeted on hard benches until their mothers pinched them into stillness. Candlelight flickered across the faces around her, casting dancing shadows that made everyone look haunted. Near the front, she could see Garrick Ironhand sitting with his father, the blacksmith Aldous, a mountain of a man with burn-scarred forearms and a face that had long ago given up trying to control his son. Garrick lounged in the pew like it was a throne, one arm draped across the back, his expression somewhere between bored and contemptuous. Father Benedict's voice rose and fell in practiced rhythm. "Deliver us from evil, O Lord, and keep us safe in your eternal grace. Protect us from the dangers that lurk beyond our walls, from the darkness that prowls in." The howl cut through his prayer like a blade through silk. It started low, rising from somewhere deep in the forest, a sound so massive and primal that it seemed to vibrate through the very stones of the chapel. One wolf, then another, then a chorus, a symphony of wild voices that echoed across the valley and made the colored windows rattle in their frames. The congregation froze. Several women gasped. A child began to cry. Father Benedict's hand trembled, the cross wavering in his grip. Aeliana's breath caught in her throat. She knew those voices. She'd grown up falling asleep to them, had learned to distinguish each pack member by their song. That deepest howl, that was Fenrir, and he was close, closer than he'd been since she arrived. Without thinking, she smiled. The howls continued, layering over each other in a harmony that was beautiful and terrifying. The wolves were singing to the moon, announcing their presence, marking their territory. They were singing to her. "They're close now," she whispered, too quiet for anyone nearby to hear. Or so she thought. "What's that, forest girl?" Garrick's voice rang out from the front of the chapel, shattering the prayer-like silence. He'd turned in his pew, that familiar cruel smirk back on his face. "Scared of dogs?" Several villagers turned to look between them. Father Benedict lowered the cross, uncertain whether to continue the service or address the disruption. Aeliana met Garrick's eyes across the candle-lit space. Outside, the howling reached a crescendo, so loud now it seemed to press against the walls. "Those aren't dogs," she said clearly, her voice carrying in the stone chamber. "And they're not what you should fear." Garrick laughed, but it sounded forced. "Listen to her. The witch speaks in riddles." He stood, playing to his audience. "Everyone knows the wolves are just animals, dumb beasts prowling in the woods, too afraid to come near our walls. Then why,
Old Aldrich Greystone spoke from the shadows near the altar, his voice like gravel. In all the centuries Thornmere has stood, have the wolves never once attacked our village? The question hung in the air like incense smoke. Heads turned toward the elder. Even Father Benedict looked uncertain. Villages all around us lose livestock. Travelers disappear on the roads. But Thornmere? Never. Not one sheep taken. Not one child harmed. His eyes found Aeliana's across the pews. Some might wonder why that is. Coincidence, Garrick said, but his voice had lost some of his confidence. Or good walls. Or old agreements, Aldrich replied. Old promises made between men and others. The howling outside began to fade, the wolves' song diminishing into the gathering night. In the silence that followed, Father Benedict cleared his throat nervously. Let us continue our prayers, he said, raising the cross again with trembling hands. Lord, protect us from the beasts that prowl in darkness. Keep us safe behind our walls. Guard us from the wolves that— They don't need guarding from the wolves, Aeliana said, surprising herself with her boldness. She stood, and every eye in the chapel turned to her. The wolves aren't the danger here, Father. They never have been. Garrick took a step toward her down the aisle. You want to say that again? Aeliana's hand moved unconsciously to her pendant beneath her dress, feeling its weight. I'm saying that the wolves have kept their word for 70 years. The question is whether the people of Thornmere will keep theirs. Enough, Father Benedict's voice cracked like a whip. This is a house of God, not a place for whatever superstitious nonsense this is. But his eyes darted to the windows where darkness had fully fallen, and something that might have been fear flickered across his face. The congregation began to murmur, uncertain and afraid. Garrick still stood in the aisle, his fists clenched, clearly wanting to say more, but aware that even he couldn't brawl in a chapel. Aeliana moved toward the door, and the crowd parted for her like water around a stone. As she passed Aldrich, the old man whispered, 2 more nights. 2 more nights, she confirmed. She pushed open the heavy wooden door and stepped into the night. The air was cold and sharp, carrying the scent of pine and earth. Above, the moon hung 3/4 full, growing towards its blood-red culmination. From the forest came one final howl, Fenrir's voice, unmistakable and powerful. Aeliana touched her pendant and whispered in the old tongue, I hear you, Father, soon. Behind her, the chapel door closed, and she could hear Father Benedict resuming the prayers, louder now, more desperate, praying to his God for protection from wolves that had never harmed them. She smiled into the darkness and began the walk back to her room, wondering if Garrick Ironhand would be wise enough to heed the warnings or foolish enough to seal his own fate. The moon would tell soon.
The grain storage building sat at the edge of the village, a squat stone structure with a thatched roof and narrow windows set high in the walls. Aeliana had been sent there by the baker's wife to fetch 2 sacks of wheat flour, honest work that paid in bread and copper coins. The interior was dim, even in daylight, lit only by dusty shafts of sun that filtered through the high windows. Now, with evening approaching, shadows pooled in the corners like dark water. She was hefting the second sack when she heard the door creak open behind her. The quality of light changed as someone's bulk blocked the entrance. She didn't need to turn around to know who it was. She could smell the forge smoke on his clothes, the ale on his breath. "Garrick," she said quietly, not turning. "The baker is expecting this flour." "The baker can wait." His voice was different here, away from the crowd, lower, more dangerous. The door swung shut with a heavy thud, and she heard the scrape of the wooden bar dropping into place. Now she turned. Garrick stood with his back against the door, his broad shoulders blocking the only obvious exit. In the dim light, his face was half shadow, but she could see the anger there, still simmering from the chapel.
Aeliana's eyes adjusted quickly, better than any humans should. She catalogued the space in an instant. Grain sacks stacked along the walls, a ladder leading to the loft, tool handles leaning in the corner, and there, a narrow window above the wheat stores, barely wide enough for a child, but possibly manageable. 8 paces to her left, Garrick between her and the door. He outweighed her by half again her weight, and his reach was longer. But he didn't know how to hunt. "You embarrassed me," Garrick said, taking a step forward, in front of everyone, in the market, in the chapel. Another step. "You think you're clever, don't you, with your cryptic words and your forest witch nonsense." Aeliana set down the flour sack carefully, keeping her movements slow and non-threatening. Fenrir had taught her that predators responded to flight with chase, to aggression with attack, but calculated stillness, that confused them. "I think," she said evenly, "that you're used to people being afraid of you." "They should be afraid." He was 5 paces away now. "I could break you like kindling." "Probably." She shifted her weight slightly, imperceptibly, closer to the window. "But that's not what really scares you, is it?" Garrick stopped, his brow furrowing. "What?" "Breaking things, hurting people. It's easy for you. You've been doing it your whole life." Aeliana tilted her head, studying him like Fenrir studied prey before the hunt, looking for weakness, for the soft, vulnerable places. "Your father is a master blacksmith. His work will last generations. People will use his tools, admire his craft, tell stories about Aldous Ironhand's skill." She took a small step sideways, toward the grain sacks near the window. "But you? What will they say about Garrick? That he was strong? That he was cruel? Those are common things. The world is full of cruel, strong men who leave nothing behind but fear and ashes." "Shut your mouth!" Garrick grabbed a grain sack and hurled it across the room. It struck the wall and exploded in a cloud of wheat flour, the fabric tearing. Dust filled the air, making the light even dimmer. Aeliana didn't flinch. "You're afraid no one will remember you when you're gone, that your life will mean nothing. So you hurt people to feel powerful, to feel like you matter. But deep down, you know the truth. You're already forgotten, even while you're still here." Garrick roared and lunged for her, but Aeliana was already moving. She'd spent 12 years hunting with wolves, learning to read the shift of weight before the pounce, the tension in muscles before the strike. Garrick was strong and angry, but he was slow. She darted left as his hands grasped empty air, her feet finding purchase on a stack of grain sacks. She leapt upward, her fingers catching the window ledge, the same window she'd measured earlier. Behind her, Garrick crashed into the wheat stores, cursing. "Come back here, you little—" But Aeliana was already pulling herself up with a strength that should have been impossible for her size. Her body moved with fluid grace, contorting through the narrow opening like water through a crack in stone. For just a moment, silhouetted against the evening sky, she looked back down at him. Garrick stared up at her, breathing hard, flour dust coating his hair and shoulders, and in his eyes, beneath the rage, she saw it. Genuine confusion, fear. She'd moved too fast, climbed too easily. No ordinary girl could have done what she just did. "Those aren't dogs in the forest, Garrick, and I'm not who you think I am." Then she dropped from the window and disappeared into the gathering dusk, leaving him alone in the ruined grain store, surrounded by torn sacks and spilled wheat, wondering exactly what he'd just encountered. He stood there for a long moment, his heart hammering, his hands trembling with adrenaline, and something else, something he'd never felt before when facing another person. Uncertainty. Outside, Aeliana moved quickly through the village streets, her pulse racing but her mind clear. She'd revealed too much, moved too fast. He'd seen her strength, her speed. The careful facade of helpless outsider girl was cracking. But 2 more nights, just 2 more nights until the blood moon rose and Fenrir returned. She could remain invisible that long. She had to. Behind her, in the grain store, Garrick Ironhand finally moved. He kicked a sack of flour, sending it skidding across the floor, and stalked toward the door. His mind churned with rage and confusion, but one thought burned brightest. That girl was not natural, and unnatural things needed to be driven out. As he emerged into the evening air, he was already planning his next move. The village needed to see what she really was, and if that meant forcing her to reveal herself, then so be it. The moon hung overhead, growing fuller by the hour, and in the forest beyond, the wolves had gone silent, watching, waiting, counting down the hours until the blood moon rose and ancient promises came due.
Aeliana sat at the small wooden table in her room above the chandlery, the silver-etched knife laid before her like a prayer. The whetstone made soft, rhythmic sounds as she drew the blade across it, a meditation Fenrir had taught her years ago. Focus comes from repetition, he'd said. The mind sharpens as the blade sharpens. The memory rose unbidden, as it always did when she touched the knife. She was 6 years old again, small and terrified, crouched behind the burned remains of what had been her home. Smoke still rose from the village, her village, the one whose name she could barely remember now. The raiders had come at dawn, mercenaries seeking plunder from settlements too small to defend themselves. They'd taken everything of value and left nothing but ash and bodies. She'd hidden in a root cellar while the screaming stopped. When she finally emerged, the world had gone silent except for the crackling of dying fires. She remembered walking through the ruins, her bare feet blackened with soot, looking for her mother, her father, anyone. But there was only smoke and stillness and the terrible understanding that she was alone. That's when she'd heard the growling. She'd turned to find 3 massive wolves emerging from the tree line, each one larger than any natural wolf should be. Their eyes glowed in the dim light, amber and silver and gold. She should have run, should have screamed, but she had no fear left. Fear required hope, and hope required a future, and she had neither. The largest wolf, silver-gray with eyes like moonlight, had approached slowly. When it was close enough that she could feel its breath, warm against her face, it had done something impossible. Its form had shifted, bones restructuring, fur receding, until a man stood before her, tall and ageless, with silver hair and those same luminous eyes. "Child," he said, in a voice like distant thunder, "you are alone?" She'd nodded, unable to speak. "Then you are pack now." Fenrir Nightwhisper had lifted her onto his broad shoulders and carried her into the forest, into a world she'd never imagined existed. The pack had become her family, not just Fenrir, but a dozen others who moved between wolf and human form as easily as breathing. They'd taught her to hunt, to track, to read the language of the forest. They'd taught her patience and strategy, the long view that wolves took when stalking prey. "Humans think in moments," Fenrir had told her one night as they sat by the fire. "Wolves think in seasons. That's why we survive when others fall." She'd grown up between 2 worlds, human by day, learning human ways in the settlements they passed near, but wolf at heart. She'd learned to fight, though Fenrir always emphasized that the best victories came without bloodshed. "The strong wolf knows when to show its teeth," he'd said, "and when to simply let the foolish prey destroy itself." Now, 12 years later, she set down the whetstone and held the knife up to the candlelight. The silver etchings along the blade caught the glow, pack symbols that marked her as family, as protected, as one who belonged. Fenrir had given her on her 16th birthday, the night she'd truly understood what it meant to be pack without being wolf. "You'll never transform," he'd told her gently. "The blood doesn't work that way, but you're no less my daughter for it. You're pack in the ways that matter, in loyalty, in wisdom, in the bonds we choose rather than the ones we're born to." She touched the pendant at her throat, matching silver marked with the same symbols. Then she turned to the small piece of parchment on her table and picked up her quill. The ink was still wet on the words she'd written. "Father,
There is one here who needs to learn the old lessons. He thinks cruelty is strength. He believes fear is power. He doesn't understand that true dominance comes from restraint, not violence. The blood moon rises in 2 nights. I trust you will know what to do." She folded the letter carefully and held it to the candle flame, watching it burn. The smoke rose toward the ceiling, carrying her words into the night air. Fenrir had taught her this too, how to send messages through fire and wind, old magic that predated human settlements. Outside her window, the moon hung heavy and bright, 2 nights away from fullness. 2 nights until it would turn the color of blood, until Fenrir returned from his territorial patrol along the realm's borders, until the pack gathered for their sacred rites. 2 nights until Garrick Ironhand learned what it meant to threaten the Alpha's daughter.
Aeliana sheathed the knife and tucked it into the hidden pocket of her cloak. She'd need to be more careful now. Garrick had seen too much, suspected too much. He would escalate. Men like him always did when their power was questioned. She moved to the window and looked toward the forest. Somewhere in those ancient trees, the pack was preparing. She could almost hear them, not with her ears, but with something deeper, the connection Fenrir called the bond. They were waiting for his return, waiting for the blood moon, waiting to see if the humans of Thornmere had honored their ancient treaty, and waiting to see what justice required for the one who dared harm Pack family. Aeliana pressed her palm against the cold glass, remembering that terrified 6-year-old girl in the ruins. She'd been saved by wolves and raised by an alpha who'd taught her that family was choice, not blood, that strength was patience, that the greatest predators were those who never needed to prove it. 2 more nights, Father, she whispered to the darkness. Then he'll understand. The candle flickered behind her, casting her shadow long across the floor. And for just a moment, in the dancing light, her shadow seemed to have too many teeth, too much wildness, as if the wolf she could never become still lived somewhere inside her, waiting for the moon to rise. The forest edge was a place of transition where cultivated land surrendered to wilderness. Ancient oaks twisted skyward, their gnarled roots breaking through the earth like arthritic fingers. The undergrowth grew thick with ferns and brambles, and the air carried the scent of moss and decay, and something wilder, the musk of animals that watched from the shadows. Standing stones jutted from the ground at irregular intervals, covered in lichen and carved with symbols so old that weather had nearly erased them. Aeliana moved carefully through the liminal space, her basket over one arm and her eyes scanning for the blue-flowered comfrey that grew only in the deep shade. The afternoon sun barely penetrated the canopy here, and the temperature dropped several degrees once she passed the invisible boundary between village and forest. She could feel it like a pressure change, the shift from human domain to pack territory. She was kneeling beside a cluster of comfrey when she heard the heavy footsteps behind her. No attempt at stealth. Garrick wanted her to know he was there. "You come here alone," he said, his voice carrying through the trees. "That's foolish. Dangerous things live in these woods." Aeliana continued gathering the herbs, her fingers working methodically. "Yes, they do." She could hear him moving closer, branches snapping under his boots. When she finally turned, he stood 10 paces away, partially silhouetted by the filtered sunlight. His hand rested on the knife at his belt, not drawing it, but making sure she saw it was there. "You think the woods will protect you?" Garrick took another step forward. "Think the animals will save you from me?" Aeliana stood slowly, brushing dirt from her skirt. Behind Garrick she could see one of the standing stones, taller than a man, its surface covered in spiral patterns and angular runes that most villagers had long since forgotten how to read. But she knew them. Fenrir had taught her the old language, the symbols that marked treaties and boundaries and sacred laws. "This stone," she said, gesturing past him, "do you know what it marks?" Garrick glanced back, irritated. "Old rocks. The forest is full of them." "That one specifically marks the place where your grandfather stood 70 years ago, where Garrick Ironhand, father of your father Aldous, swore an oath to the pack." Garrick's expression shifted, confusion beneath the bravado. "My grandfather?" Aeliana walked toward the stone, and Garrick instinctively stepped aside, letting her pass. She traced her fingers over the carved symbols, feeling the grooves worn smooth by decades of weather. Aldrich was a wise man. Thornmere had lost 12 people in one winter, travelers taken on the roads, shepherds who ventured too far, a child who wandered into the trees. Your grandfather understood what was happening. The pack was testing the village, seeing if humans could be trusted to respect the old boundaries. "You're talking nonsense." "So he came here," Aeliana continued, her voice steady, "to this stone, which marks the treaty point, and he met with Fenrir Nightwhisper, alpha of the great pack that has guarded these forests since before any human settlement existed. They made an agreement." She turned to face Garrick. "The pack would harm none of Thornmere's people, and Thornmere's people would harm none of the pack's family." Garrick laughed, but it sounded hollow in the thick air of the forest. Old wives' tales, stories to scare children. "Then why," Aeliana asked quietly, "has Thornmere never lost another person to the forest? 70 years, Garrick, not one attack, not one death. Villages all around you suffer, but not Thornmere. Your grandfather's wisdom bought that safety. His oath protected generations." She moved closer to him, close enough to see the uncertainty flickering in his eyes. "He promised the pack, 'We harm none of yours, you harm none of ours.' A simple treaty, fair, binding." "Binding?" Garrick's hand tightened on his knife. "To what? To animals?" "To creatures older and more powerful than you can imagine, to beings who have kept their word for 70 years while asking only one thing in return: respect." Aeliana's eyes locked with his. "Your grandfather understood what you don't, that mercy given is not the same as weakness, that teeth concealed are more dangerous than teeth bared." "You're insane," Garrick said, but his voice had lost its edge. "There are no packs, no treaties, just wolves, animals." Aeliana tilted her head, listening to something he couldn't hear. "You mistake the pack's mercy for weakness, Garrick Ironhand. That will be your undoing." "Is that another threat?" "No, it's a fact." She gestured to the ground around the standing stone. "Look." Garrick followed her gesture, and his face paled. There, pressed into the soft earth, were wolf tracks, massive prints, far larger than any normal wolf could make. They circled the stone in a deliberate pattern, fresh enough that moisture still darkened the disturbed soil. Dozens of them, maybe more, all moving in the same direction, toward the village. "They've been watching," Aeliana said softly. "They always have been. The treaty holds because both sides honor it, but if one side breaks their oath—" She didn't need to finish. The implication hung in the air like morning mist. Garrick took a step backward, his eyes scanning the shadows between the trees. "I haven't broken anything. I haven't touched any wolves." "No," Aeliana agreed, "but you've touched me." The words fell between them like stones in still water. Garrick's expression shifted from confusion to comprehension to something approaching fear. "You're saying you're what? Part of this fantasy? This pack?" Aeliana reached into her dress and pulled out the silver pendant, letting it catch the filtered sunlight. The wolf's head gleamed, and the ancient symbols matched those carved on the stone beside them. "I'm saying," Aeliana replied, "that Garrick Ironhand would have recognized this pendant, would have understood what it means, what protection it grants, what consequences follow when it's threatened." From somewhere in the forest, too close, impossibly close, came a howl. Deep and resonant, it rolled through the trees like thunder. Then another joined it, and another, a chorus of voices that seemed to surround them, coming from every direction at once. Garrick stumbled backward, his hand now fully gripping his knife. "This is a trick, some kind of—" "2 nights," Aeliana said, over the fading echoes of the howls. "The blood moon rises in 2 nights. My father returns with it, and then, Garrick Ironhand, we'll see if your grandfather's wisdom died with him, or if there's any hope left for his bloodline." She picked up her basket and walked past him, back toward the village. Behind her she could hear his ragged breathing, could feel his eyes on her back, but he didn't follow. The howls had done their work, planting seeds of doubt that would grow into fear. When she glanced back from the edge of the tree line, Garrick still stood by the ancient stone, staring into the forest depths where golden eyes watched from the shadows, neither fully believing nor able to fully deny what he'd just been told. And in 2 nights he would learn the truth. The moon hung swollen in the evening sky, no longer the pure silver of nights past, but tinged with copper at its edges, a warning of what was to come. 2 nights until it would bleed red across the heavens, 2 nights until Fenrir returned, and the entire village could feel the change in the air, like the pressure before a storm. Aeliana noticed it first in the animals. The chickens in the market square refused to settle at dusk, clucking nervously and pacing their coops. The baker's dog, usually docile, had begun howling at irregular intervals throughout the night, long, mournful cries that set other dogs barking in response until the village echoed with canine distress. The blacksmith's horses stamped and snorted in their stalls, their eyes rolling white when anyone approached. She was drawing water from the well when Margaret, the weaver's widow, caught sight of her hand, the same hand that had been sliced open just 2 days ago when she'd caught herself during her escape from the grain store. The cut had been deep, bleeding freely, and Margaret herself had seen it when Aeliana bought thread the next morning. Now there was nothing, not even a scar. Margaret's bucket slipped from her fingers, clattering against the cobblestones. "Your hand," she whispered, loud enough that others nearby turned to look. "The cut, it was—" Aeliana pulled her hand back, tucking it into her sleeve, but it was too late. The baker's wife had seen, so had the chandler's apprentice. Whispers spread through the square like ripples in a pond. "Unnatural," someone murmured. "Witch-touched," another voice added. By noon, Garrick had seized upon it like a drowning man grasping driftwood. He stood in the market square, his voice carrying over the midday crowd, 3 other young men flanking him. Rolf, the tanner's son, Willem, the miller's nephew, and Corin, whose family farmed the eastern fields, all of them followers, all of them eager to be part of something larger than themselves. "You've all seen it," Garrick proclaimed, playing to the gathering crowd. "Wounds that heal overnight. She speaks to wolves. She knows things no outsider should know." He pointed toward where Aeliana stood at the edge of the square, her basket clutched tight. "She's cursed, demon-touched, and she brings that curse into our homes, our streets." A few people nodded. Others looked uncertain, but fear was contagious, and Garrick was spreading it with purpose. "My grandfather made some pact 70 years ago. Fine, maybe he did, but that was before she came here." Garrick's voice rose. "Before our livestock went mad, before our dogs forgot how to be dogs, before the forest itself started watching us."
Father Benedict emerged from the chapel, his face drawn and pale. In his hands he carried a piece of bark, fresh torn from a tree, the white wood underneath still weeping sap. Carved deep into its surface were symbols, angular and deliberate, marked by claws that had scored through bark and into heartwood. "I found these," the priest said, his voice shaking, "on 7 trees at the village boundary, all facing inward, all marked in the same way." He held up the bark so the crowd could see. "These are warnings. The beasts are coming." Aeliana's breath caught. She recognized the symbols, pack markers, territorial warnings written in the old language. "The time approaches. The oath will be tested. Stand ready." They weren't threats to the village. They were messages to her, but explaining that would only make things worse. "See?" Garrick's voice cut through the murmuring crowd. "The wolves know she's here. They're circling because of her. As long as she stays, we're all in danger." "That's not—" Aeliana started, but her voice was lost in the rising tide of fear. She pushed through the crowd, walking quickly toward the edge of the square. Behind her, she could hear Garrick rallying his followers, could feel the village turning against her. The isolation was complete now. Whatever cautious acceptance she'd earned was evaporating like morning dew under the heat of fear and superstition. She found Aldrich Greystone in his small cottage at the village edge, tending his fire. He looked up as she entered, and something like sadness crossed his weathered face. "They're afraid," Aeliana said without preamble. "Garrick is turning that fear into violence." Aldrich nodded slowly. "Mobs are like fire, child. Once they catch, they're hard to stop. Tell them to keep him restrained for his own sake." She moved to the window, watching the red-tinged moon rising. 2 more nights, just 2 more nights, and my father returns. If Garrick can just— "And if he can't?" Aldrich interrupted. "If they don't? Then what then?" Aeliana was quiet for a long moment, her hand touching the pendant at her throat. "Then ancient law will speak. The treaty is clear. Harm to pack family demands answer. Fenrir won't have a choice. Will there be bloodshed? That depends on Garrick." She turned back to the old man. "My father is just, but he's also alpha. If the oath is broken, if violence is done to me under the blood moon—" She didn't finish. She didn't need to. Aldrich stood with difficulty, his bones creaking. "Your grandfather would be ashamed," he said quietly. "Garrick Ironhand, my brother in all but blood, he understood balance. He knew that strength and wisdom must walk together." He moved to his mantel and took down a small wooden box. From inside, he withdrew a faded piece of parchment, yellowed with age. "This is the original treaty," he said, unfolding it carefully. "Your father's mark here, in blood. My brother's here, in ink. 2 nights from now, we'll know if Aldrich's wisdom outlasted him, or if his grandson's foolishness will undo 70 years of peace."
Outside, the sun was setting, and the moon climbed higher. In the distance, from the forest, came the first howls of the evening, closer than they'd ever been, a countdown marking the hours until the blood moon rose and the pack returned to see if the humans had honored their word. Aeliana left Aldrich's cottage and made her way through streets that seemed suddenly hostile. Doors closed as she passed, windows shuttered. The village was preparing for something, whether siege or judgment. She wasn't sure they knew themselves. In the square, Garrick and his followers were still talking, their voices carrying through the evening air, planning, scheming, building courage from shared fear. Aeliana touched her pendant and whispered to the rising moon, "2 more nights, Father. Hold on. 2 more nights." But even as she spoke the words, she could feel the inevitability building like storm clouds on the horizon. Some things, once set in motion, couldn't be stopped, only survived. and Thornmere was about to learn the price of breaking faith with wolves. The torches were already lit when Aeliana entered the village square, their flames dancing in the evening breeze and casting long shadows across the cobblestones. The entire population of Thornmere seemed to have gathered, men, women, children pressed together in a semicircle, their faces orange in the firelight. At the center stood Garrick Ironhand and his 3 followers, waiting like hunters who'd set a trap and watched their prey walk into it. Aeliana had known this moment would come. She'd felt it building all day in the nervous glances, the whispered conversations that stopped when she drew near, the way people had begun to avoid her completely. Fear had reached its tipping point, and now it needed release. She walked forward steadily, her basket over her arm, refusing to show the apprehension that twisted in her gut. One more night, just one more night, and Fenrir would return, but she had to survive this first. "There she is," Garrick called out, his voice carrying across the square. "The witch who's brought curse upon our village." The crowd murmured but didn't part. They formed a wall around the square's perimeter, trapping her in the center with Garrick and his followers. Aeliana set down her basket slowly and straightened, meeting his eyes. "I've cursed no one," she said clearly. "I've done nothing but work honestly and keep to myself." "She heals like demon spawn," Garrick shouted to the crowd. "Wounds that should take weeks vanish overnight. She whispers to wolves in the forest. She knows things, old things that no outsider should know." He took a step toward her. "She's brought the beasts to our doorstep. The signs are everywhere. Our animals have gone mad. The forest watches us. The moon itself bleeds red." Several people made signs against evil. Aeliana saw Father Benedict standing near the chapel steps, his face anguished but silent. Margaret, the widow, looked away when their eyes met. Even Master Wyndham, her landlord, wouldn't meet his gaze. Only Aldrich Greystone stood apart, leaning heavily on his walking stick, his expression grave. "The moon turns red every few years," Aeliana said, keeping her voice level. "It's a natural cycle, not natural." Garrick laughed harshly. "There's nothing natural about you." He moved closer, circling her like a wolf, though he had no idea how apt the comparison was. His hand shot out faster than she expected, fingers closing around the chain of her pendant. Aeliana's hand moved to stop him, not fast enough, not when she was trying to appear human, trying to move at human speed. The chain snapped with a sharp crack that echoed across the suddenly silent square. Garrick held the pendant up triumphantly, the silver wolf's head spinning on the broken chain. Then, with theatrical contempt, he threw it to the ground. It clattered against the cobblestones, and in the torchlight, or perhaps in the light of the rising moon, it seemed to glow faintly, the symbols along its edge pulsing with an inner luminescence. The crowd gasped collectively. Several people stepped back. Aeliana felt something shift inside her chest, not pain exactly, but a severing. The pendant had been more than jewelry. It was a marker, a protection, a physical symbol of the treaty. And Garrick had just broken it, with witnesses, under the watching moon, one night before the blood moon rose. Her eyes met his, and for an instant, just a heartbeat, they flashed silver, reflecting the moonlight like an animal's. "You should not have done that," she said, and her voice carried a resonance that hadn't been there before, something that vibrated in the chest rather than the ear. Garrick faltered for a moment, but his followers rallied around him. "See?" Rolf shouted. "Her eyes! Did you see?" "Demon," Willem added. "Witch." "Boy," Aldrich Greystone's voice cut through the rising panic like a blade. He pushed through the crowd, moving faster than his age should allow. "You've broken sacred law." "Sacred law?" Garrick spun to face the elder. "I break nothing. I protect our village from this creature." He pointed at Aeliana. "I'll drive this demon from our midst before she destroys us all." "The only thing you'll destroy," Aldrich said quietly, "is the peace your grandfather died to preserve." Aeliana bent down slowly and picked up the pendant. The chain was broken, but the silver itself was warm to the touch, almost alive. She closed her fingers around it and looked up at Garrick, at the crowd, at the faces painted orange by torchlight and twisted by fear. "Tomorrow night," she said, and her voice carried to every corner of the square, "the blood moon rises. My father returns with it, and we'll see who answers for what." "Your father?" Garrick sneered. "More fantasy, more lies." "No lies," Aeliana replied. She turned in a slow circle, meeting the eyes of the villagers who'd bought her bread, hired her for work, passed her in the streets. "Tomorrow you'll see the truth. You'll understand what Garrick Ironhand knew 70 years ago, that some oaths are binding, that some treaties are written in blood, and that breaking them has consequences." She looked back at Garrick. "You had a chance to choose wisdom, to honor what your grandfather built, but you chose cruelty instead. You chose to break rather than build, and now the choice is no longer yours." "Are you threatening me?" Garrick's hand moved to his knife. "No," Aeliana said softly. "I'm telling you what will happen. Tomorrow night, when the moon bleeds red, Fenrir Nightwhisper will return. He will see the broken pendant. He will know the treaty has been violated. And then, Garrick Ironhand, it won't matter what you think or what you believe, because ancient law doesn't require your faith to enact its justice." She walked toward the edge of the crowd, and despite Garrick's bravado, despite the fear and anger in the air, the villagers parted before her. No one reached out to stop her. No one dared touch her. Even in their fear, or perhaps because of it, they recognized that something larger than village politics was unfolding. As she passed Aldrich, he whispered, "May God have mercy on us all." God won't be the one who decides, the pack will. She walked through the parted crowd, past the torches, into the darkness beyond the square. Behind her, she could hear Garrick rallying his followers, trying to reclaim the moment, but his voice sounded hollow now, uncertain. Above, the moon hung nearly full, its edges already beginning to blush with the red that would dominate tomorrow night. And from the forest came a single, long howl, Fenrir's voice, unmistakable and powerful, announcing that he was close now, that he was coming home, and that the time of reckoning had arrived. Aeliana climbed the stairs to her room, clutching the broken pendant, and began to prepare for the blood moon's rise. One more night, and everything would change. The treaty had been broken. Now the consequences would unfold. The bonfire rose 20 feet into the night sky, a pillar of flame that pushed back the darkness and painted the village square in shades of gold and crimson. It was tradition, the Blood Moon Festival held every few years when the lunar cycle aligned, a night to celebrate harvest, to make offerings to the forest, to honor the old ways that most villagers no longer understood but maintained out of ancestral habit. Musicians played drums and pipes, their rhythms primal and infectious. Children danced around the fire's perimeter while their parents drank ale and wine, laughing with the relief that came from communal celebration. At the forest edge, villagers had placed offerings, bread and salt, dried flowers, carved wooden tokens, gifts meant to appease whatever watched from the trees. Above it all, the moon rose enormous and blood-red, dominating the sky like a wound in the heavens. Aeliana stood at the edge of the celebration, her cloak drawn tight despite the fire's heat. She held the broken pendant in her palm, its silver warm against her skin.
She could feel Fenrir approaching, not with her ears, but with something deeper, the bond that connected Pack family across any distance. He was close now, very close. She should have stayed in her room, waited for him there, but something had drawn her to the square. Perhaps it was the need to witness this final chapter, or perhaps it was simply that she was tired of hiding. Garrick saw her first. He stood near the ale barrels with his followers, his face flushed with drink and the fire's heat. When their eyes met across the flames, his expression hardened. He said something to Rolf and Willem, and the three of them began pushing through the crowd toward her. The music continued, but people nearest to Garrick stepped aside, sensing the violence in his movements. Aeliana didn't run. There was nowhere left to run, and one way or another, this would end tonight.
"Let's see your wolves save you now," Garrick shouted as he closed the distance. His words slurred slightly. He'd been drinking heavily, building courage from the bottle. "Night of the blood moon, and where are they? Where's your demon father?" He was 5 paces away. 3. Close enough that she could smell the ale on his breath, see the wildness in his eyes. "Garrick, don't!" she started. His fist caught her across the face with brutal force. The impact snapped her head sideways, and she stumbled backward, tasting copper. Blood welled from her split lip and dripped onto the cobblestones, 3 dark drops that glistened in the firelight, falling onto ground that had been blessed for the festival, onto sacred space during lunar rites. The music stopped. The celebration died as if someone had snuffed a candle. For 3 heartbeats, there was only silence and the crackling of the bonfire. Then, from the forest, came a howl. Not one wolf, but 100, an explosion of sound that rolled across the village like thunder. The ground itself seemed to vibrate with the force of it, and the bonfire flames wavered as if blown by an impossible wind. Villagers screamed, children clutched their parents, even Garrick froze, his drunken bravado evaporating as the howls multiplied, grew louder, came closer. The tree line erupted with movement. Wolves poured from the darkness, but these were no ordinary wolves. Each stood as tall as a horse at the shoulder, their eyes blazing gold and silver in the firelight. Their fur rippled with barely contained power, and when they moved, it was with a coordination that spoke of intelligence, of purpose, of rage held carefully in check. And at their head, emerging between 2 ancient oaks, came Fenrir Nightwhisper. He was massive, the largest wolf Aeliana had ever seen, even in her 12 years with the pack. His fur was silver black, rippling with muscle beneath, and his eyes burned like molten moonlight. When he opened his jaws, fangs longer than daggers gleamed, and his growl was a sound from nightmares, from ancient stories told to frighten children into obedience. The villagers scattered like leaves before wind, pressing against buildings, fleeing into doorways, but the wolves had already surrounded the square, cutting off escape. They didn't advance, they simply stood, waiting, a living wall of fur and fang and primal power. Garrick stumbled backwards, his face pale as bone. "No," he whispered. "No, this can't." Aeliana pushed herself upright, wiping blood from her mouth. She stepped forward, placing herself between Garrick and Fenrir, and when she spoke, her voice carried across the square with absolute authority. "Father, the law has been broken." Fenrir's massive head swung toward her, his silver eyes taking in the blood on her face, the broken pendant clutched in her hand. His growl deepened, shaking the cobblestones, and several villagers collapsed to their knees in terror. "Father?" Garrick's voice cracked. "Father? No, that's not. You can't be." Eldred Greystone stepped forward from the crowd, his ancient frame trembling, but his voice steady. She is Aeliana Blackthorn, daughter of Fenrir Nightwhisper, alpha of the Great Pack, adopted into the blood 12 years ago, marked with the treaty seal." He pointed to the broken pendant. "The sacred protection has been violated. The oath your grandfather swore has been broken by his own blood." Fenrir's attention fixed on Garrick like a hawk focusing on prey. The great wolf took one step forward, then another, each movement deliberate and terrible. The other wolves began to circle closer, their eyes never leaving Garrick's trembling form. "Please," Garrick whimpered, all his bravado stripped away. "I didn't know. I swear I didn't know." "You were warned," Aeliana said, and though she spoke quietly, every person in the square heard her. "In the market, at the forest edge, last night in this very square, you were given mercy, given chances, given time to choose wisdom." She moved closer to him, blood still dripping from her chin. "But you chose cruelty instead. You chose violence. You chose to break what your grandfather spent his wisdom building." Garrick fell to his knees, tears streaming down his face. "I didn't know. How could I know? Please, I'm sorry. Ignorance is not innocence." Fenrir growled again, and the sound promised death. The pack tensed, ready to tear Garrick apart on their alpha's command. Justice for treaty violation was swift and absolute. But Aeliana raised her hand. "Father," she said, meeting Fenrir's blazing eyes, "I will not answer his violence with death." The great wolf's head tilted, questioning. Aeliana turned to face the villagers, all of them watching with terrified fascination. "The treaty stands. Thornmere remains under pack protection. You have done nothing wrong. But he," she pointed at Garrick, "cannot remain. Exile by dawn. Let him learn what it means to survive without the protection his grandfather earned." Fenrir studied her for a long moment. Then, slowly, impossibly, his form began to shift. Bones restructured, fur receded, and where the massive wolf had stood, a man emerged, towering and ancient, with silver hair that fell past his shoulders and those same luminous eyes. He wore simple leather and fur, and when he spoke, his voice was like distant thunder. "You chose mercy," Fenrir said, placing one massive hand on Aeliana's shoulder. "When you had every right to choose vengeance. That is wisdom. That is strength." His eyes swept across the assembled villagers. "That is why she is my daughter." He looked down at Garrick, who cowered on the cobblestones. "You will leave at dawn. You will never return. And you will spend the rest of your days knowing that you destroyed everything your grandfather built, not through strength, but through weakness, not through courage, but through cruelty."
Two villagers, Aldous the blacksmith and another man, stepped forward and hauled Garrick to his feet. His father's face was a mask of shame and grief. They dragged the sobbing Garrick away toward his home to gather what few things he'd be allowed to take. The pack began to fade back into the forest, their work complete. But Fenrir remained, standing beside Aeliana as the blood moon reached its apex. "You've grown," he said quietly. "I learned from the best," she replied. And as the village slowly, cautiously resumed breathing, Aeliana Blackthorn stood in the firelight with her father beside her, no longer hiding, no longer running, finally able to walk in both worlds without shame. The treaty had been tested and held, and Thornmere would remember. Aeliana Blackthorn had won, not through fangs or fury, but through the wisdom of wolves, patience, strategy, and knowing when mercy is the greatest strength. She could have chosen vengeance. She could have let Fenrir exact the full price that ancient law demanded. But she'd learned from 12 years with the pack that true power lies not in how much damage you can inflict, but in how much damage you choose not to. Garrick Ironhand left Thornmere at dawn, alone and broken, carrying nothing but the clothes on his back and the weight of his shame. He became a cautionary tale told in taverns across the realm, the fool who struck the Alpha's daughter, the arrogant boy who mistook mercy for weakness and paid for it with everything he had. Some say he still wanders the borderlands, jumping at shadows, forever haunted by the memory of silver eyes in the darkness. But Aeliana? She stayed in Thornmere. She walked as a bridge between two worlds, daughter of both moon and sun, human and pack. The villagers came to understand what Aldrich Ironhand had known 70 years before, that the wolves at the forest edge weren't their enemies, but their protectors, and that the quiet girl who gathered herbs had saved them all from the consequences of breaking faith. Thornmere learned an ancient lesson that night under the blood moon, that true monsters don't lurk in forests. They don't have fangs or fur or glowing eyes. True monsters hide in human cruelty, in unchecked power, in the arrogance of those who mistake kindness for weakness. The wolves had kept their word for 70 years. It was a human who broke the oath. But those who stand with pack stand forever protected. And Aeliana Blackthorn would make sure that Thornmere never forgot. If this tale of ancient justice stirred your spirit, honor it with a like. Let the algorithm know that stories of patience, wisdom, and chosen family deserve to be heard. Subscribe for more stories where the bullied find their fangs, where the quiet ones reveal their true power, and where mercy proves stronger than violence. Comment below, what would you do if you discovered supernatural protectors watching over you? Would you have chosen mercy, like Aeliana, or would vengeance have been too tempting to resist? And share this story with someone who needs to remember, the quiet ones often run with wolves. Sometimes the girl who says nothing is the most dangerous person in the room, not because of what she'll do, but because of who stands behind her when the moon rises red. The blood moon will rise again. The pack is always watching, and some treaties are written in blood that never washes away. Until the next tale, remember, true strength isn't found in how hard you can strike. It's found in knowing when to stay your hand.